Ireland has voted overwhelmingly to allow abortion. Is this the end of the pro-life movement in Ireland? How will it affect the relationship between the Catholic Church and the state? And what happens next? And Europe has introduced a new regulation that could cost companies millions of euros to comply with data protection rules. Why is it so stringent, and will it set a precedent for other countries around the world? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. The Republic of Ireland has voted overwhelmingly to overturn a constitutional amendment that bans abortion in almost all circumstances. The final tally showed that just over 66% of voters who cast valid ballots wanted to abolish the 8th Amendment, which was adopted following a referendum in 1983. The provision places the rights of the fetus and the rights of its mother on an equal footing, effectively banning abortion, barring a real and substantial risk to the mother's life. With a turnout of 64%, all but one constituency voted in favour of the Yes campaign. Irish lawmakers are now expected to enact legislation allowing for terminations in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy and later in cases where there is a risk to the mother's life or the fetus is not expected to survive. This vote is another milestone for Ireland after it legalized contraception in 1979, divorce in 1995 and same-sex marriage in 2015. So what happens next? And will those who voted no carry on campaigning against the bill going through the Dáil, the lower house of the Irish Parliament? Joining me from Dublin on the line is Maeve O'Hanlon, a spokesperson for Love Both, which campaigned against legal abortion, and Dr. Greene, an assistant professor at Durham Law School in the UK, but originally from Ireland. And welcome to both of my guests. But let me go to Dr. Greene first. As I said, 64% of turnout, higher than Ireland's referendum on same-sex marriage, which was passed in 2015. Why this has been such an emotive issue in that country?
Well, I think it's been an issue in Irish politics, I suppose, for 35 years, ever since the 8th Amendment was inserted into the Constitution by, at the time, a very strong grassroots campaign. Over the years and decades since then, Ireland then had a subsequent number of referendums to deal with the impact of that referendum. For example, in 1992, following a tragic case involving a young girl who was subject to statutory rape, essentially the state tried to preclude her from travelling to the UK for an abortion. There was, in the aftermath of that court case, there was a movement began to grow, I think, at that point, which constitutionalised and protected the right of Irish women to travel to the UK for an abortion. We then subsequently had further referendums in 2002, which actually tried to roll back the right to an abortion in Ireland on the grounds of risk to life, on the grounds of suicide. However, that was profoundly defeated. And then subsequently then it was really, I suppose, the tragic case of the death of Savita Halappanavar, which many contributed to Ireland's abortion restrictions that have led to this moment of a grassroots campaign, I think, that has ultimately led to this point in time where I suppose politicians really have got to the point where they've actually caught up with where Irish society is.
Well, basically, we're talking about that girl originally from India who had to carry on her pregnancy despite the fact that it was found that the baby had some kind of abnormal, dangerous situation, which later took her own life. So that also set off a lot of debate on this issue. But Dr. Greene, let me continue by asking you this question. How come there is such a big margin between the people who voted yes and the people who voted no? Whereas before the vote, the forecast was about neck to neck.
So, from my understanding of it, actually quite a few of the polls did show a strong lead for repeal against retain, so in favour of liberalising Irish abortion laws. However, quite a large number of people were undecided, and generally speaking in Irish referendums, people who are undecided tend to break towards against constitutional reform. So you would assume they would break towards the status quo. However, I think it was the grassroots campaign that happened in Ireland, where it was basically women explaining their stories, talking to people, and campaigners talking to people on the ground, that basically exposed the reality that actually the retention of the 8th Amendment was the extreme position, and that the moderate position was actually to repeal it, to actually let the Irish Parliament decide. And parliaments in Ireland, in constitutional democracies, they're the branch of our society, of our government, that's designed to deal with disagreement. If you disagree, you vote for you know, politicians who agree with your position, and they debate the laws and they regulate it. And I think it was messages like that women's messages, their own personal experiences as to how extreme Ireland's ban on abortion was. I think that spoke to people, that spoke to people's compassion, and ultimately people voted, I believe, in a compassionate manner.
There is also a very interesting phenomenon, that this correlation between age of the voters and their opinion. For instance, it appeared an exit poll said that repeal was supported by over % of voters that's aged between 18 and 34-year-olds, just over 70% of voters aged 35 to 49 years old, and just over 60% of voters aged over 50 and 60. And people over 65, however, voted mostly against the change. What does that say about the kind of composition of the Irish society and their political opinions, or liberal or conservative?
So I certainly think that it shows that Ireland is becoming a much more liberal country, that our views are becoming much more in line with what you see in the rest of Europe. I think the older generations very much would have come from a country where the Catholic Church still had a very, very strong position in Irish life. And while it still does to an extent, it's certainly not as strong, certainly from, say, from my generation. And we've seen over the decades just a steady, as you've mentioned at the start of your report, a steady kind of liberalisation and rollback of the Catholic Church, and at least their influence in the Irish Constitution to make Ireland more of a republic, where we have a clear separation between church and state, then, as distinct from the Ireland that we used to have, where the views of a vast majority of I suppose the Irish society at the time were entrenched in the Constitution. We're seeing now a rollback of that and a liberalisation of that, and I think that this referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, I suppose, is the cherry on the top of that.
Let me go to Ms. O'Hanlon, who is now with us online. Ms. O'Hanlon, welcome to the show. Explain to us why did you campaign so vigorously against the lifting of this amendment?
Well, I think the reason I got involved in campaigning was that the more I researched myself about the realities of abortion, the more I realized that I hadn't been aware of, and the more I realized actually Irish people in general weren't aware of the realities of abortion. It's not something we talk about a lot in Ireland, and I've discovered during this campaign that in a lot of countries, even where abortion is legal, it's not something that people speak about a lot. And the things that I discovered about abortion, for example, were just how graphic, and I would say even barbaric, the procedures are. What happens to a baby during an abortion is pretty unpleasant to read about, to see, to hear. It's unpleasant for doctors and nurses to perform. It can be physically difficult for a woman. But on top of that, it also can be very traumatic emotionally for women. And the more I looked into it, the more people I met, I spoke to, I heard their stories. I heard the stories of hurt, of trauma, of pain. I have had people in my own life come to me and tell me, they had an abortion 10, 15, 20 years ago in a country where it was legal, or illegally in Ireland, and you know they
right. I get your
still
point.
grieve for the loss of their baby.
Right.
That
But
it is still for them really hurtful, and we haven't heard those stories in this debate
Right.
very much. Abortion has been presented as compassionate and progressive, but in my view, it's actually quite regressive. And I think there are many more compassionate options, more compassionate supports and choices we can and should offer to women.
Is banning abortion a solution to stop that kind of, to ignite that kind of discussion and to stop the so-called brutality you described?
Well, I think the thing is that while there is still some level of abortion in Ireland, and many women travel to other countries like Britain where abortion is legal, so the Eighth Amendment did not prevent every abortion, but we have a rate of abortion that is much, much lower than any other country in Western Europe where abortion is legal. For example, in Ireland we have a similar population size to Scotland. In Ireland we have around 4,000 abortions every year. In Scotland they have 12,000 abortions every year. In Britain, 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in abortion. So other countries that are similar to us culturally have much higher rates of abortion. So
well,
we have
people would
estimated
say it's
that
because you
100,000 lives
exported
have been
your
saved by the
abortions
Eighth Amendment.
across the, you know, to the UK, to the closest possible destination where you
can. But this is the thing. While some people did travel, an awful lot of people involved in the pro-life movement are women who themselves, in a situation where they became pregnant and they panicked, and they said, if there was an abortion clinic just down the road, my daughter would not be here. They say, my child is alive today because of the Eighth Amendment. And we have over 100,000 people alive today in Ireland because of the Eighth Amendment. And I know for Chinese listeners that might sound like a tiny number, but for us, we only have around 4.5 million people. For us, that is a huge number of lives.
Okay.
And we look...
Yeah, I see. This is really a very heated debate, and it can go on for a long time. But now that this referendum has been passed with such a large margin, what are you going to do? Are you going to continue campaigning for it, or what are your next moves?
Well, I think within Love Both, our vision and our mission has always been to do what we can to protect, to love both mother and baby, and to provide better supports for mothers and babies. And while it is very clear that people have chosen to allow for choice, for women to choose, I don't believe they have voted for abortion on demand in the grounds that the government wants. I think many people who voted yes actually did so even though they don't like the idea of abortion. Our government promised us restrictive abortion. No other country has managed to keep the numbers low once they legalize it, but we will hold our government to that promise, to try to keep it restrictive, and we will certainly continue to provide better choices, better supports, so that often we hear women say, I had an abortion because I thought I had no other choice. So we will continue to provide support services, so no woman is worried about being made homeless if she has a baby. No woman is worried she will lose her job or she can't afford childcare. We would ask our government to provide better support, more support for women, so that they don't feel in that desperate position where they feel they have no other choice, and to ask a doctor to end their child's life.
Okay, let me go back to Dr. Greene here. Dr. Greene, what is your response to what some of the things that Ms. O'Hanlon said, for instance, that many people voted simply because it's what the government wanted them to do, if I understand correctly?
Well, firstly, I would say, that that abortion is compassionate, and that Ireland did have and still does have abortion. It's just we exported it to the United Kingdom. As someone who flies over and back quite frequently between Ireland and Britain, you know, you do see girls on planes on their own who look quite upset, and it's pretty much unspoken as to the reason why they're taking the flight. In terms of what will happen now with regards to the legislation, although we've amended the Constitution, the law still stays the same until the legislation is passed. I think the fact that Love Both are still campaigning against this legislation shows precisely why it didn't belong in a Constitution in the first place. Had we voted to retain the Eighth Amendment, there would be no discussion whatsoever as to what the law should be. The status quo would stay the same. What we have now, in terms of putting it into the hands of the legislature, into the hands of the Dáil, to reform Ireland's abortion laws, is that Love Both can continue to articulate their vision as to what Ireland's abortion laws or lack thereof should be, and the Parliament and their parliamentarians should listen to it. But in terms of support for the actual legislation, Love Both very much throughout the campaign were stressing that if you vote to repeal the 8th Amendment, you are supporting the government's proposed legislation, which includes terminations up to 12 weeks without any reason.
Okay. Many thanks to my two guests, Maeve O'Hanlon, a spokesperson for Love Both, which campaign against illegal abortion, and Dr. Alan Greene, an assistant professor at Durham Law School in the UK. We'll be taking a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what many have called the most stringent data protecting law in the EU and its implications for companies around the world. Stay with us. In Europe, a new law that gives citizens of the European Union more control over their personal data has just come into force. Record-high fines will be imposed on companies found in violation of the new General Data Protection Regulation known as the GDPR. The maximum fine could be 20 million euros or 4% of a company's annual global revenue, whichever is higher. The GDPR replaces a previous law governing data protection passed in 1995, heralding what some have called the strictest data protection rules in the world. So why is it so stringent? Could it stifle innovation? And how would foreign companies be impacted? Joining me from Durham are Professor Tom Brooks, head of the Durham Law School at Durham University, and in Beijing, Bruce Fu, vice chair of the ICT working group of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, and also senior director and co-lead of the global tech practice of APCO Worldwide, a public affairs consulting firm. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Brooks, let me come to you first. Compared with the previous data protection rules in the EU and any similar rules in other countries and other parts of the world, why is this law considered the most stringent? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it is probably one of the more stringent regulations, and it does something very important. It transfers effectively power in the hands of businesses and companies that have had personal data about individuals, and it transfers power to individuals over their own data, the use and indeed often the misuse of their data. So there's new restrictions on companies need to have more clear consent from individuals to use their data, to gather the data, and they have to make very clear to individuals what uses they will be making of it, and if there's any kinds of problems with the security of individual data, this can't go hidden under the radar. This has to be reported in 72 hours. Often we saw cases where there had been some type of breach, some type of hack into people's emails or to some kind of social media platform. This had gone unreported for many years to those who were affected. These are the kinds of things that will be ruled out. So it is big. It is a very big change. It goes a lot further than what we see elsewhere. And it's also, I think, raising a lot of eyebrows as a lot of companies and firms across the European Union and around the world try to get their heads around what exactly is required to make sure they don't get hit by these potentially very significant fines for breaching.
Yeah, Mr. Fu, to help us better understand this regulation, talk to us about how the rest of the world, including China, is reviewing these new rules, and under what circumstances would foreign companies run afoul of them?
Yes, and currently I think in the most part of the world really view the GDPR very seriously, because they set up a very high standard requirements in terms of compliance. And I think for the business society, they are very busy with compliance work currently. And also I know, and especially for Chinese company, they also, I think, pay attention to the law, because of the rule applied to this and to the all Chinese companies that collect data and process data on the European, we call it European residents within the EU. So for instance, and this also includes this company have operation within the Europe and also outside of Europe. For instance, if you are a car maker, if you sell cars to the European markets, for instance France or Italy, even though you don't have a presence there, but however, if you do sell the car to this in the markets today we all have a smart car, right? And we have this collecting data. The car can generate data on this driver's information, such as location data. So this data can be considered as this personal information. So the law will cover that. So I think this is similarly, and for e-commerce company, they also need to be think about that. And then when they collect data on this purchasing behavior and also purchasing information, including cookie information, it's also covered. But I think a lot of trans companies they may not be they're aware of this the regulations, especially this company operating within China. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, compliance costs for companies are estimated to be huge. Professor Brooks, the analysis conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers indicates that 68% of U.S. companies will spend $1 million to $10 million to comply with the new GDPR rules. So what companies will be affected most negatively? Do you agree that these kind of rules could actually, or for the near future, hamper innovation?
I think it'll affect mostly the bigger companies more than the smaller in terms of the scale of the data collection operation that the larger firms operate within. So I think that there'll be a kind of a very big hit there. A lot of us in the European Union have been getting emails up to a real avalanche in the run-up to 25th of May asking whether or not we wanted to opt out of different email lists and other types of things relating to this data collection from big companies in particular. That said, I think it will also hit smaller companies as well that might not have very extensive email lists or might not have much data collection, but there's only a few people in the company to try to work out they are compliant or not. So I think it's going to hit firms that are large and small, but probably the bigger ones most. Will it have a negative effect perhaps on innovation? Possibly. I mean, it might have some kind of dampening effect on that. That said, part of me is not that, I want to say, sympathetic to their plight. There's been a lot, and I mean a lot, of misuse of individual data. There's been a lot of carelessness by companies, big firms, in the use of individual data that they have been using and abusing, how they store it, the purposes that they have for the data. They're selling it on to firms without the express consent of those that are affected. And so there will be a big cost in these companies. Well, I think that some of these companies shouldn't have been doing this in the first place, and this legislation is probably long overdue.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said earlier, Mr. Fu, that the cost of compliance could be huge, and for foreign companies, some of them might not even be aware of what would be waiting for them along the road. So will, Mr. Fu, will the GDPR rules become a barrier for foreign, including Chinese companies entering the EU market?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think a different company from different markets, they will have different compliance requirements, and the GDPR apply to all the companies, and including Chinese company. I think this company has to do a lot of things, including putting a lot of money and adding more people, changing business process. Some companies have even changed their business model. I think in this way, definitely it may become a barrier in terms of this compliance cost. But however, we can also think about that because of EU is such a big market. If a company can meet such high standards, then they will put them in a better position in the context of global competitions.
Mr. Brooks, do you see the law or similar laws being pushed through in other parts of the world beyond the EU in the near future? Mr. Brooks.
I don't see anything at the moment, but I think that I completely agree with the gentleman's previous comment and his earlier comments as well. That I think that those companies that are able to meet these higher standards set by this EU law, I think this will put them in a very good position globally. I mean, one of the big problems we have with companies and individual data is trust over the safe use of individual data, and if firms are able to meet this higher standard of safely using, collecting, and utilizing individual data, I think that's a very good way of building not only public trust, but also trust from different companies, and puts them in a very competitive position.
Right. Right,
and hopefully other countries, other regions will follow suit.
Yeah, Mr. Fu, do you see other countries or other regions follow suit in the near future? Very briefly, please.
Yes, I think probably some country may consider that, but however, I think EU has particular situations. And first, like in US, I think they may take a different approach. They are more focused on like defense and for the enforcement works. But I think EU has a particular case, to set up such high standards to protect the privacy and also information protection of individual and citizenships.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Professor Tom Brooks at Durham University and Bruce Fu of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. And here is my point, my personal commentary. Earlier in the program, we talked about the abortion referendum in Ireland. In theory, the holding of referenda is one good way for people to make their voices heard. Some countries, such as Switzerland, hold referenda regularly. It's almost a way of life there. Sometimes, however, the results of a referendum can have unexpected consequences, such as when the UK voted for what has come to be known as Brexit, after which many suggested this was not what they had really intended. The result of the Irish abortion referendum, however, is a very different story in that both the turnout and the contrast between the yes and no votes were very high, thus sending a very clear message. And this could have consequences in other countries, with some suggesting there will be an almost unstoppable pressure for abortions to be allowed in Northern Ireland, which at present also outlaws the practice. This is not unusual whenever changes are brought in, where the so-called ripple effect moves on to create change in other territories. The personal data protection regulation could well be another case in point. Although it could be costly and inconvenient for some to comply, it could well be where the future lies, not just in Europe, but across the world, as the internet is very much a global phenomenon. As John Donne famously wrote, "No man is an island." That is all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.